A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Luke. Lord, be on my mind, be on my lips, and in our hearts. Jesus took Peter, John, and James and went up the mountain to pray. While he was praying, his face changed in appearance, and his clothing became dazzling white. And behold, two men were conversing with him, Moses and Elijah, who appeared in glory and spoke of his exodus that he was going to accomplish in Jerusalem. Peter and his companions had been overcome by sleep, but becoming fully awake, they saw his glory and the two men standing with him. And as they were about to part from him, Peter said to Jesus, "Master, it is good that we are here. Let us make 3 tents, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." But he did not know what he was saying. And while he was still speaking, a cloud came and cast a shadow over them, and they became frightened when they entered the cloud. Then from the cloud came a voice that said, "This is my chosen Son. Listen to him." After the voice had spoke, Jesus was found alone. They fell silent and did not at that time tell anyone what they had seen. The Gospel of the Lord. Last week, you remember, we were in the desert, right? Dry, barren, can't see much. This week, we're up on the mountain. Beautiful sights, and we can see clearly. And Jesus is being revealed as God. It is that simple, but it's so incredible, is it not? We think of that. We don't think of that enough. God become incarnate in Jesus Christ. The first reading, Genesis, God makes a covenant with Abram, and he made covenants with Moses. And a covenant is becoming family. It is joining into a relationship. And in this covenant, God makes with his people, Israel, his chosen people, he does something weird. Now, this is 3,000 years ago. They take all these animals, they cut them in half, they split them. Doesn't sound good so far, does it? And what that is reminiscent of is the way 3,000 years ago people entered into a covenant. And the idea was if you walk between the carcasses, you are saying that if I am not faithful to this covenant, that's what's going to happen to me. And so God makes this covenant with Abram, and guess what? Abram doesn't walk through the carcasses because Abram's not going to be faithful. None of us are totally faithful to that relationship that God makes in us. And so, God, on behalf of us and Abram, in the smoking pot, just like he led the people Israel through the desert, fire by night, cloud by day, God himself walks through the carcasses and says that I'm going to be faithful, and more, I am going to bear the consequences not of my unfaithfulness, but of your unfaithfulness. He is predicting what God is going to do in Jesus Christ to establish the new and everlasting covenant. And that's the same reality we see on the mountain. Moses and Elijah appear with Jesus, glorified, but Jesus more so glorified. And they speak of his exodus. Jesus is performing the walking through death, the consequences of our unfaithfulness and sin, and making us again members of his family. He is doing this. And not only he can do this because, in the first reading, it is God that walked through the covenant carcasses. Jesus is God. Now, how do we know that? The passage is trying to show that in every possible way for people who know the Scriptures. Right? His glorified figure is reminiscent of the way God has appeared, especially in many places, but especially the book of Daniel, chapter 7, verse 9. The vision of Daniel where the heavens open, and there's one on the throne who is glorious and shining brightly. And then another, like the Son of Man, comes before him and comes on the clouds of heaven. There are many other ways this is being revealed that Jesus is God. Moses and Elijah are people that in the Old Testament encountered God, but they could never see God's face. They only saw God's back. But now they see his face. And then when the cloud comes over, the cloud is reminiscent of God's theophany in two places, at least on the mountain to Moses, but also when the temple was first dedicated and the cloud came down upon the tabernacle. And Peter in this scene is saying, let's build 3 booths. He's thinking of the Feast of Tabernacles, which remembers how Israel's people in the Exodus went through the desert in tents and built tents every night, but the meeting tent where God would speak to Moses face to face would be overshadowed by a cloud. And so in many other ways it's being revealed that Jesus is God. He is enacting this covenant. Consequences of sin and death, our unfaithfulness, he is bearing and walking through so that we can be family with him. It's an amazing scene, and it's a scene that really happened. It's a scene that really happened. How do I know that? It's in the Scripture. It's in the Bible, right? But there's another passage in 2 Peter chapter 1, verse 16, I think. I was going to bring it with me, but I forgot my Bible. And Peter says, people, what I'm telling you are no clever invented myths. We were with him on that holy mountain when his glory was revealed to us and God spoke. Listen to him. This is God's revelation, truly beyond our full understanding. But just as God was with his people, his chosen people, 3,000 years earlier, God is present. Moses and Elijah, Peter, James, John, and Jesus on the mountain. That tabernacle that the cloud overshadowed was the tabernacle that contains the Ark of the Covenant and eventually the bread that came down from heaven, the manna. God knows no time. God is beyond time. And in this one scene, you see all of history before us. God in the center on the mountain being revealed through Jesus Christ. His presence had been present all along. And all the prophecies and the preparation proves that he is God fulfilling them. And his presence continues on this holy mountain. His body and blood, the true bread that came down from heaven. The one who walks through the carcasses, if you will, the one who is faithful to the covenant on our behalf, giving us his very self, making of our imperfect, sinful lives a sacrifice acceptable to God making us one body, one blood with Jesus, his beloved Son, making us too his children. And he feeds us, and he guides us, and leads us to himself. And so as you come forward for this Eucharist, recognize this great gift in which we participate, to truly receive the bread that came down from heaven, to be brother and sister of Christ, children of God, members of his family, fed by him on the journey of life as we come down through the mountain in our lives this week, and serve him the best we can. Come back next week, imperfect, failing sometimes succeeding, offering ourselves again to him, renewing that covenant, receiving his life that continues to lead us on our exodus to serve him, to be a member of his family here and forever.